Yeah.
You got to do this from your heart, meaning your inner soul.
Yeah.
Bruh, where you had said you had put the cookies, bruh? Niggas is hungry.
Uno, dos, tres, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Probando 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. ¿Está bien? Para los que están acá en sala, en unos segundos ya comenzamos. Muy buenos días para todas y para todos. Es un placer reencontrarnos en esta tercera jornada de la 8ª Conferencia Ministerial sobre Sociedad.
We are starting our 8th Ministerial Conference on the Information Society in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the last session of our 3-day conference, and we are streaming it and the YouTube channel of ECLAC, so you're all very welcome. ELAC is a hashtag to share information. We're going to start straight away. We're going to have a very agile morning with lots of information and to share with you from this stage. We're going to be talking first about the green transition in a digital world. Sebastián Rovira will be the moderator. He's the Economic Affairs Officer of the Division of Production, Productivity and Management of ECLAC. So please come up front. We're going to have Laura Lacuague, who is the coordinator of the environmental unit of the Ministry of Industry, Energy and Mining of Uruguay. Mr. Sebastián Nieto Parra is the head of the Latin America and the Caribbean unit at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD Development Center. Mauricio Agudelo is Senior Specialist, Development Bank of Latin America, CAF. And Claudio Maggi, Strategic Affairs Manager of the Production Development Corporation, Corfo, of Chile. So this is our first session this morning. Sebastián, you can have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, and welcome. Welcome all to this panel, which is called The Green Transition in a Digital World. And the idea is to discuss the potential of digital technologies and somehow beyond that, the link between the industrial policy and the digital policy and the role to support this productive transformation. 2 days ago, we submitted a report on the World Economic Outlook with our partners from CAF, OECD, and the European Commission, which is called Green and Fair Transition. And that's one of the things that we have to see how we can speed up the process in our countries. Of course, we're not responsible for the pollution in our planet. When you analyze the countries that are polluted the most, we are not, but we are the most hit by it. 13 out of the 50 countries are Latin American countries, particularly in the Caribbean. Therefore, it's important to think, and we underscored that in the document. So I'd like to table this topic here in this panel. We should think about this transition spaces and this green spaces as an element that can boost the productive transition that has to do with the energy matrix, to focus on sectors that are more intensive in knowledge, that add value, and to transform sectors that we've already got. So we can't say that because these sectors are polluting a lot, we have to leave them aside. We have to think about how to include technology, how to include digitalization in these sectors, because one of the things precisely is that they should have a much lower impact on climate change in the CO2 production, but also to increase productivity. One of the Achilles' heel is productivity, and we've been saying this in ECLAC. So how we change this productive process is a key issue. I'd like to start this panel then with one first question, and I'll give the floor to Mauricio, who is there at the end of the row. Let's think about the main challenges that we face in the region to be able to promote the adoption of digital technologies in strategic sectors, helping to have a lower environmental impact. Thank you, Sebastián. I'm very happy to be in this panel. I think this is one of the most important challenges faced by Latin American countries. I think there is a sense of urgency. Intergovernmental platforms show the challenge of climate change and productivity and the development of the economies. I think that the first challenge has to do with with financing. The World Economic Forum has indicated that this region requires $77 billion to adapt their economies to the climate challenge. From CAF and in COP26 last year, we launched an important strategy so that we could have something like $25 million, including projects with this green component. Something important that Sebastián mentioned, Latin America is not one of the regions, and our countries do not contribute to greenhouse effect gases. Our region only contributes 80%, but we suffer the consequences of climate change. And that's another challenge, and it's the challenge of the balance and financing. Although it's true that we require $77 billion, the public sector may cover up 25%, and so we have the challenge of the private investment. Well, we have the challenge of decarbonization of transport and in energy, how we can move to management, comprehensive management systems, sewage, water resources, and the development of policies and better green institutionality in important sectors such as agriculture. Let's think about transportation. Transportation contributes to with 25% of greenhouse effect gases, and also the productivities of cities. The urban space produces symbiosis among entrepreneurial structures, consumption of energy, and transportation. So this is the transition towards mass transport, including clean technologies, and also transport in logistic chains, supply chains. So all these transition systems towards electric transportation is important. We've been promoting a regional strategy called Emotion. This involves the electric mobility, but it also poses a challenge in other important sector, which is energy, referring to decarbonization. And Sebastian said this transition in the energy matrix, although it's true that in Latin America about 56% production and transmission is based on the water resources with a very high potential in wind power and gas and energies that can be environmentally friendly. From the digitalization standpoint, there are enormous challenges in terms of transition for gas systems, but also the energy transition from the digitalization standpoint involves management and the optimization and the provision of services. And so we can see data analytics, intelligent transmission in households, so that from the standpoint of generation and control of the service, there will be a better knowledge about demand curves. So in case of crisis or risks, you may manage matrices to flatten those consumption curves and distribute energy. So you can really dwell on that in transportation energy. There's another important topic that has to do with agriculture. Agriculture is a very broad subject because the important thing here is to move towards models or strategies allowing for a digital transformation of sectors. And so we can see sectors such as climatically intelligent agriculture, agrotech systems, control agricultural systems. We've promoted many projects in Colombia and in Peru where we tried to look at agriculture linked to logistics, and there we have technologies from the digitalization point of view, the Internet of Things, machine-to-machine drones, and other devices trying to improve management, as well as water resources, pest controls, so that agriculture can have a sustainable productivity, environmentally friendly. Another important thing in cities, and taking into account the fact that Latin America is one of the most urbanized regions in the world, 85% of its population lives in cities, and that's where we have the flow of clusters. And then we have to understand how we can use technology from an intelligent standpoint in the territories. So we have important strategies. Last year, we launched a project called Biodiversities. Basically, it tries to include all mechanisms. Sometimes they call them smart cities, but the use of technology to manage a more efficient way and more environmentally friendly way in cities. And another important thing that I'd like to mention as well is that 25% of waste is done in the open air in Latin America. And here we have the circularity of inputs and products, how we can expand the useful lifespan of devices, supply and consumption chains that will allow us to extend the useful life cycle of products. And that's going to have an impact on the emission of greenhouse effect gases and also a lower impact on ecosystems and biodiversity. And the challenge there lies with institutional standpoint as well. It's important to strengthen agencies that protect the environment, everything that involves the use of artificial intelligence devices, having data about the climate, the atmosphere, to generate intelligence in the decision-making process and designing environmental policies in relation to environmental protection measures. To sum up, then, basically, what we can see is that that goal of trying to reduce gases, emission of greenhouse gases, is to comply with the Paris goals. There is an important effect here. It's estimated that digitalization and digital transition can contribute to a reduction by 15% of greenhouse effect gases if that goal is complied with. And so it's important to work on adaptation mitigation policies, particularly adaptation in Latin America, financing and balancing, which isn't very concentrated. But the other thing has to do with understanding biodiversity from the technological standpoint. And the other thing has to do with the understanding of new technologies and managing them so that territories can be managed better. And the question of promoting circularity and having a circular economy. Thank you, Mauricio. I don't know if he's left something for the rest of us to discuss, but I'll get to give the floor to Laura. She's the coordinator of the environmental unit of the Ministry of Industry, Energy and Mining of Uruguay. Would like you to tell us a little bit about, from the standpoint of Uruguay, thinking about these main challenges and considering what's happening in the territory. What is it that we see? As you said, Sebastián, there is something here that is a matter of concern, particularly what you've just said is a weakness, but it's also an opportunity. We have the possibility of changing many of these challenges, but also taking advantage of them, because our continent has all the opportunities to be able to do so. If we think about the main structural problems that we have that involves these inequalities that continue in Latin America, as is shown in the paper presented some days ago, the question of low productivity and how institutions are fragile, and that's quite generalized in our continent. Uruguay has a condition which allows it for certain strengths and a certain institutionality which isn't fragile, much on the contrary. Every single administration has shown that we have state policies, they are carried on and followed up. And there's a tradition in our country which has to do with electric energy matrix based on renewable sources, up to 97% on average. And I'm mentioning this because any technology, if there is no possibility of plugging your computer, then you can't develop it. So the energy source based on renewable sources is basic. And something that Sebastián also mentioned, and it was really encouraging me to talk about this, there is another aspect of the structural change which has to do with social inequalities that are still in place in Latin America. And among other places, this involves territoriality. What you said about this question of urbanization and the concentration of the population in urban areas. So more and more rural areas become more isolated and populations are more vulnerable. They have difficulty to have access, not only because it's very costly to take power up to those areas, but there is a fundamental point which has to do with training, with the skills of those citizens to make use of those technologies. If they don't know how to use basic technologies, basic ICTs, it's quite unlikely that they'll be able to take up other opportunities. As I said a while ago, the question of the policy of Uruguay with green hydrogen. Now, the idea is that the entire package is in the rural areas. That's where the renewable energy sources are generated on the basis of wind power or solar power, hydrolysis, the production of hydrogen, or moving into another product with a higher added value. But the fact that this is generated in the territories makes it competitively an opportunity. And it also raises the opportunity for people living in the rural areas to have jobs. And those jobs require certain skills. And then education is the other fundamental element. So I wanted to underscore these two elements because sometimes they are left aside. That is, the energy source is fundamental. We only have 2,000 citizens without energy, electric energy. When this administration concludes its mandate, we're going to have everyone having access to electrical energy. That's one very big step. The other thing has to do with education and training so that everyone can have access little by little to the use, and not only use the use, but become creative. That's something else that most certainly we will discuss. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I think that this is something that is most important, and it's a way of trying to identify this and look at the potential when you think strategically, particularly the development of green hydrogen, for example, how this is going to be done, how you can involve the people in the territory, thinking in the not only of the impact, but in creating jobs, giving opportunities, generating value. And we were talking about inequalities, and I think that what you were saying about social inequality, productive inequalities, and technological inequalities. And I'd like to give the floor now to Claudio, asking him then in this characteristics, thinking about the characteristics that we have in Latin America and the Caribbean, this structural heterogeneity that we have in our productive sector, and how precisely this type of innovation and the use of friendly technologies, environmentally friendly technologies in companies, particularly in micro SMEs, to reduce these gaps.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here and to share this panel with you. In fact, when we look at the challenge of advancing towards decarbonized matrices in these countries, and also to go along with these opportunities involving digital tools, we have a whole array of technological options to expand access to digital solutions that might enable advancing in a far more equitable and effective way towards more sustainable production models. And there's a whole array of policies which, on one hand, adopt technological adoption of small enterprises and small producers, and at the same time that they favor the technological offer, which is knowledge and services based, specialized areas, the development of devices. So there's a virtuous connection between the demand and that favors innovation. Now, for this to occur, we have to close certain gaps. Mauricio already referred to this when he took the floor, and also Laura. We have an enabling gap in terms of certain elements that are necessary, and this has to do with a connectivity platform in terms of coverage and in terms of quality. Uruguay is a clear example of leadership in the region in this sense. There are other countries that have more difficult situations for geographical and social and economic reasons. Now, without doubt, if we really want this to progress, and so that the transition is as fair as possible, we have to take care of these gaps. This is not only regarding infrastructure, it also has to do with standards, regulations, and also training human skills, as Laura said. So this is sort of unequal in terms of the situation. In some countries, a fair transition is a challenge that forces us to think outside the box. On the other hand, we have the transitional gap. How can we close that digital divide? How can we take care of the territorial imbalances? In Chile, we have a production matrix based on natural resources, and the core of production is in territories which are not major cities. Mining, agriculture, forestry, these are in areas where they don't have the best connectivity conditions. So the major companies figure out solutions for their problems, but this is not the case of the neighboring communities and the rest of the territory. So it is a key issue that we have to consider this rich amount of opportunities in generating services and generating products and more and cleaner processes. But for this to occur and for value to be created, we have to have a virtuous cycle through innovation. And we really have to provide these enabling conditions and these enabling situations for this to occur. Now, in terms of innovation, of collaborative platforms, of data management, which allows us to prepare predictive algorithms, and all this related to the devices people have, so that the small farmers, through their mobile phones, can really access technology, and this can be used for dissemination of technology. With that aim, policies have to consider spaces dedicated to favoring this technological adoption. This also includes dissemination of this. Thank you very much, Claudio. We will come back to some of these points in the second round, and maybe thinking of some instruments, what is being done at the level of the ministries. So really have to land all these things. And maybe some things that are not being done, but are being considered. As Laura and Claudia mentioned, we'll come back to the innovation hub that is being promoted and how environmental and sustainable issues can play a fundamental role. But now I'd like to give the floor to Sebastián so that he can tell us what OECD is doing in terms of the work done at the Development Center, namely how industrial policies and these instruments developed around these can encourage eco-innovation. This is one of the other things that we have to take into account, namely how can we apply these processes in a cross-cutting manner and reach out to the largest number of sectors as possible. Because we come across standards and regulations, and if we're not well prepared, many will remain along the way and not reach the goal. So how can we tackle these things? Thank you very much, Sebastián, and thank you, ECLAC, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion today, namely how can we link the production processes vis-à-vis a new industrial policy required in Latin America, and digitalization and the green transition have to be at the core of all this. Now, these are topics that we included initially in our reports on Latin America, the ones we produced at the OECD, together with CAF and with the LEO. And the 2022 edition spoke about the green transition. There we included several examples as to how the digital transformation has to be at the core of this green transition. One of the starting points, which is essential, is that we have observed in many Latin American countries how the development plans include more and more digital transformation as well as green transition. So this is already at the core of public policies and in the planning stages as one of the objectives we have. So this has to do this is a progress compared to the development plans we had 10 years ago. And one of the important things is how can we change the production matrix, taking those elements into account. Considering all this, we have to bear in mind that there are some features that we have in Latin America, but also exist worldwide, maybe the SMEs. When we speak about SMEs, a large percentage, not only in terms of numbers, but also in job creation, And in order to bring about this disruptive change, we have to see how this can be supported. We know about competencies, and we speak about these SMEs that also generate value, and how it is important for them to become inserted in the value chain. And this has to do with the competencies and skills required. And this is not only about basic education, but also tertiary education. When we analyze the digital skills in Latin America, we see that they are lagging behind compared to the OECD standards. We have tests for adults, the PIAC test, similar to the PISA test, and we look at the digital skills and where we stand, and we see that there is an important lag in this sense regarding the skills that workers have. And this is an important point because this is included in the public agenda. Job creation, we speak about 45% of the households that are totally informal in Latin America. Now, thanks to the green transition, and of course with the digital component, we can create jobs. This is a gradual process. We have to bear in mind that this requires supporting the workers and doing follow-up. Otherwise, we can produce the opposite effect and lead to greater informality and unemployment. But if we do things properly, and these are enormous investments, more than 3 percentage points in green sectors. So in that case, job creation by 2030 through a decarbonization process will lead to an important increase in formal employment. This has been included in the Leo report. We have a scenario of 1% growth and investment in green sectors, and also the net effect is positive. So if we have job creation in the long term, this is without doubt also a transition. Let me add something that was mentioned by Mauricio, and I fully agree with that. This is a fiscal aspect. All this requires very important investments. From the fiscal standpoint, 22% of taxes in Latin America is something that can be improved. Countries like Chile and Colombia have started this process, and particularly regarding taxes related to the environment. 1% of the GDP of Latin America and 2% of the OECD countries. So we can obtain resources from taxes, but we also have to see how we can obtain funds from the private sector to bring about this transformation. And in terms of green bonds, there are many projects which very often include the technological aspects. 40% of emissions in the private sector, these started from the public sector, and now we add the private sector because from the fiscal standpoint, we have limitations. We have to add improvements for the private sector and to quality foreign investment for this aim. And to finish, this investment has to go hand in hand with research and development. In Latin America today, we have spending about 0.7% of the GDP. Now, if we look at that simple average, 0.3%. In Brazil, for example, they invest more than 1% of GDP. So here we have to see how we can apply all the efforts with all the opportunities Latin America has for investments, because there are many opportunities. We have to see how we can supplement this with the objectives included in the national development plans. And thanks to better skills and competencies, we can lead to quality investments. Thank you, Sebastián. I think you touched upon several points, and I would like to look at some of these with Mauricio. These were also mentioned by Claudio. In this equation as to how this transition can help to generate new investments, new technologies, and new solutions. What is your vision? For example, as a development bank, what is the potential you see in Latin America regarding the needs for funding that you mentioned? And how can a development bank such as CAF, that is focused on the green issues, how can a bank such as CAF support that development process? Well, I think this is the result of that goal set by CAF of investing $25 million in the coming 4 years that include the green and climate variables. This is an enormous challenge. 40% of the bank's portfolio is addressed at that. And when we internally ask ourselves, can we go about this? There are 4 areas. One is public policies, strategies that incorporate the climate change strategies into the issuing sectors, and this has to do with decarbonization policies in transport. How will we change the consumption of fossil fuels? So this requires policies and strategies, but this should also take into account the fiscal aspect. This is something that Sebastián referred to, this energy transformation, because the investment for transport requires enormous investments and the recovery does not take place in the short term. So this will require public investments that are insufficient. The other point in terms of public policies, has to do with the digital transformation policies, not only climate change in isolation. So governments are increasingly, and the plans increasingly have to start incorporating this digital variable in the environmental variable. The other topic that I think is essential, looking at sectors such as agriculture, water, and sanitation, is institutional strengthening. What we basically think is to mobilize resources for cooperation and technical assistance in order to improve governance of these agencies. Here we have an enormous challenge. This requires capacity building and skills of what we call the regulators and the policymakers vis-à-vis the challenge of solid waste management. And with that, those 17 million people in Latin America that still don't have access to water, this allows us to have integrated models for managing the water resources. So this is about incorporating this digital and technological language of machine learning, of machine-to-machine and AI to agencies and organizations and entities that somehow have not yet assimilated that technological innovation.
The other thing has to do with financing. And as Sebastián said, that designing instruments and vehicles and products for financing, catalyzing that capital market supply to green projects. And there we are working on setting up a market, a carbon market, and also green bonds. And something that is also important is including these environmental variables in the cycle. And there is a project since planning and the idea of the project, we can start introducing its management and operation and implementation in its execution stage of environmental variables. And as I said earlier, the case of energy, intelligent measurement models. Another sector which has a high demand of consumption is buildings, for instance, buildings in cities. Consumption is critical there. And we are working on strategies called BIM, which will basically allow us to improve the productivity of the transport and construction sectors, but will allow to generate projects which will be aware of the environmental impact. I think all those are important topics to work on: policies, institutional improvement, financing, in the introduction of those topics in the planning and management of projects. Those are fundamental variables. Thank you, Mauricio. I'm going to change a little bit what you were saying about the potential of certain sectors before moving on to the projects. And let's have the idea of Corfu and the Ministry of Industry and Mining of Uruguay. What other sectors, apart from those that Mauricio mentioned, are seen with a high potential to include technologies reducing environmental impact, particularly in the countries in our region? Well, there are several sectors that Mauricio has mentioned, but I'd like to focus on 5 of them where we can see a potential. And we've also seen examples where there are experiences where mechanisms of new technology have been introduced to take advantage of those technologies in the green transition. Well, the energy sector, of course, is a sector which is at the center of green transition. Although 33% of Latin American energy is renewable, at world level it's much higher, 13. And it's mainly focused on hydroelectric power. 75% is hydroelectric. In view of this 35% that we have for wind power and solar power, we can see how new technologies can increase the percentage. And it's there where new technologies play a fundamental role. Green hydrogen, for example, and how to take advantage of the input that we have in Latin America. Lithium, 60% of all lithium reserves are in Latin America. Copper in Chile. And all these capacities that we have to make the process more efficient. It's not only production, but also management and supply management and peaks in the demand, and how technologies can play a fundamental role there. The second sector has to do with transportation. Multimodal transport favors sustainable development. There's a systemic change that is required, whereby the connectivity is most important at local level. MOVES is an interesting project for urban mobility, and this is facilitating connection, but also reducing CO2 emissions. Everything has to do with share economy in the cities. Is something that we can continue empowering. To do that, you need more investments. And there is another sector, a third sector that is important when we talk about climate change, has to do with waste management. This is related to the circular economy. We have to make an efficient follow-up of the waste, and once again, new technologies play a fundamental role. The knowledge and practice of other countries, particularly European countries, may be a key factor to produce investments in everything that has to do with waste management. A fourth point that we have talked about is the South economy. This generates about $25,000 billion in GDP of Latin America, and we can empower this a little bit further because of digital transformation. For instance, fisheries, everything that we can derive from fisheries. And we have international examples such as Iceland, where the entire fisheries industry helped the creation of new technologies. So the field of digital transformation there plays a key role as well. And lastly, without forgetting that we must be at the center and the forefront of job creation. And there is the agricultural sector, the agro-industrial sector. It represents 70% of informal labor. Now, thanks to a new production scheme, we can create jobs. And there are examples such as Peru and Chile, where the process of ecosystems process has improved a lot, and this can help in changing the brown players to green players. At present, we are talking about 10% of all the jobs considered there. That's just to mention 5 sectors. Thank you. And now going back to Laura, let us talk about some experiences or some tools or how you're envisaging what are the elements that are important when you have to define policies and instruments that can help promoting digital sustainability, and how we can think about this possibility that Claudio was mentioning in the first part, to use it as a potential to create new sectors. It's that joint work that we can think of experiences and important elements to do so. All right, let's move from macro to micro. Well, we are focusing on combining high technology with education and policies, as it was said here, to promote something that you mentioned, that is growth, and that is part of a need from our country and our continent. The idea is to have a better quality of living of our citizens. So with these 3 visions, Uruguay is trying to create a digital hub that will focus mainly on achieving these goals, that is to provide a better quality of living for our citizens. The creation of a lab network and a platform promoting artificial intelligence and robotics, which is the other thing that's being promoted a lot in our country, not only through this hub, but also through education and education at secondary level. A lot is being developed, and skills that are, some playful aspects of all this that can encourage young people and attract them to this type of education and technologies. UTEC is our technological university in Uruguay. It's been in place for quite some years now, and it's a very powerful tool in Europe, which is upcountry, making reference to this question of trying to reduce inequalities. Uruguay exports software at high levels. We have quite a few $1 million in software exports, and there we can see the need for a digital hub which in some way gives a potential to better technologies and better ways of adopting it. In our projects with 7, we have the goal or the application of technologies in the gastronomic chain. Just to give you an example, that is how resources are being redirected towards that state policy where digitalization is a very important part of management, not only of the present administration, the previous one, because as you know, these projects are prepared in one administration and are executed in the following one. So once again, what we were saying about the strong institutionality is important because it allows for all these things. You also mentioned the MOVES, which is a project that is practically finishing. I'm not going to talk about it. It's unnecessary. I think that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you. Most certainly we'll be discussing this over the coffee break, but something that you said about the strong institutionality, the Ministry of Industry, but we have ANI, ANDEX, we have the territory, UTEC, the universities, research centers, and how all this is being taken advantage of. Software industry is very large. So this is at the service of our sectors and our people. It's not just one place, but it's how the potential is disseminated. So the role of the ministry and all the other institutions is fundamental. And I'd like to give the floor to Claudio from Corfo, which can share some of the many experiences he's got. Well, first of all, I would mention UTEC. I was in Durazno, up country in Uruguay. It's a wonderful infrastructure with a lab for entrepreneurs, acceleration. It's a great initiative, really to be admired. Because I was going to mention this question of territorial imbalances due to this process of changes. For quite some years at Corfu, we have reread industrial policies, stressing and looking at the Asian and European experiences, stressing the prospective component. The industrial policy must advance policies. There are some coordination failures whereby the best challenges or the best policies don't succeed because we are not coordinated among the players in the ecosystem. So I would say that with this present administration, we've been able to include the concept of vision, such as a guiding line to correct coordination failures and to anticipate trends. A vision that we think it's very clear to organize this effort is decarbonization. There is already a law in Chile about climate change stating very clear goals regarding decarbonization, and that there are replacement sources like green hydrogen, and that would contribute a lot to the carbon goal. E-mobility is another one. These are roads for policy industries. CAF and other institutions have designed and tools and offers of financial products for investment that entail one problem, particularly in the energy field. During the development process, uncertainty is very high. So we need a part of the financing, including a contingency, contingent to the success, because otherwise it's very difficult to attract an investor making an initial investment for the development where there are so many variables of uncertainty. So we have to make a blending of these facilities. That's important. And then we can go to a stage of building where there could be financing through multilateral organizations and investments from the private sector. It's important to look into that. We're talking about gigantic investments, particularly related to green hydrogen and linked to clean technologies.
Regarding green hydrogen hydrogen and electromobility, we see that on one hand, we have the task of speeding this up because this leads to decarbonization. But at the same time, these are very important opportunities for innovation in local content and the supply chain with technological solutions. So in order to have public-private governance and the support of the civil society supporting this agenda, we're working very intensively in this sense. In the case of hydrogen, research, development, and innovation involves considering all the requirements in terms of human capital that is well prepared, and we have to provide training for this aim. So we have to see how can we attract investments and development in those parts of the value chain in the country itself. So the promise for investments and generating wealth should be then reflected in an improvement of the conditions and the production matrix. In terms of electromobility, we have copper and lithium, which are very much high in demand for the electromobility chain. We are basic exporters both of copper and lithium. We think that lithium could be a very interesting option for regional cooperation together with Argentina and Bolivia. We can think with a more strategic view. So these agendas are very fertile to promote innovation. In our agency, we have demand-driven instruments which support the technological maturity process of these innovations. So this is a systemic development, and the major institutional challenge we now have is that precisely. Thank you very much, Claudia. I would have liked to have a Q&A session, but the red light is on already. Our time is up. I would like to leave space for our colleagues who will be speaking about digital government. I'd like to thank all the members of the panel. There are many topics which we haven't touched upon, but we spoke a bit about circular economy, about how digital technologies can be a very positive element, but we have to consider what digital technologies do, what we do, the components. I was speaking with Omar before I came here, how we can reduce the potential impact of these technologies regarding CO2 generation and on climate change. There are many companies that are doing interesting things, telecoms that are doing interesting work regarding energy generation for data centers and also to reach zero emissions. So thank you very much to all of you. We could have continued for one additional hour. Big round of applause for the members of the panel. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Sebastián.
Thank you very much, Sebastián. Thank you to all the members of the panel. I would like to now say that once the following panel is over, which is about digitalization, namely digital government and citizen participation, we will be taking a picture of the delegates of the countries. So prior to the break or during the break, we will be taking the picture up here. I will be reminding you this once the next panel is over. Those of you who are following us through the ECLAC's YouTube channel, thank you very much. People join us and then leave us depending on their fields of interest. Let me remind you that there are other presentations and other panels in other rooms taking place at the same time. There's a panel on smart cities, new spaces for innovation and development. This will be starting in a few minutes. This is just for those who are here in person and also for those of you following us remotely. So we're now getting ready for the next panel. The next panel is on digital government and citizen participation.
Muy bien, vamos a ir invitando.
So let us now invite the following people to come up. As I was saying, this panel is on digital government and citizen participation. The moderator is Valeria Torres, the officer in charge of the Public Management and Open Government area of the Latin American and Caribbean Institute for Economic and Social Planning of ECLAC. We will now have a remote participant, Lucas Ilves, Under Secretary for Digital Transformation of the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications of Estonia. Marushka Shokoar Reyes from Peru, from the Digital Agency, together with Pedro Quesada, Director of the Government Office for Innovation and Communications Technologies of the Dominican Republic. I would like to invite you to please come up and take your seats. And Virginia Pardo, who is the Director for the Information Society of the National Agency for E-Government and the Information Society, AGESIC, of Uruguay. Ana Karina Rodriguez, Undersecretary for the Services and Digital Country Department of the Ministry of Public Innovation of the Head Office of the Cabinet of Ministers of Argentina.
¿Se escucha? Bueno, muy buenos.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the colleagues for inviting me to moderate this panel on digital government and citizen participation. I am here with very distinguished guests. As we have seen over the past days, promoting a digital government requires strengthening digital governance. Digital governance, although we are aware there's not just one single model, this should have some conditions and should contain certain elements that I think are essential. I'd like to mention some of these. At least digital governance should include three government hierarchies. One is strategic governance that articulates the important stakeholders, establishes the political priorities and strategies, a governing aspect that includes the regulations and norms, and an executive governance that defines and designs, implements, and supports as well as resolves. So these are essential elements that we have been supporting, for example, in the Dominican Republic, for establishing this model. There's an important point that I'd like to discuss today, namely how we can involve the different stakeholders of the society in this governance, namely through citizen participation. Let me tell you that although we see in the United Nations survey on e-government of the countries of our region, and we have seen that there has been significant progress in establishing governance to promote digital government, the issue of citizen participation is still a pending issue in the region. In the latest survey, this became quite evident. Now, we are aware that there are experiences. We're aware that progress has been made. So today we'd like to focus on sharing with you some of these elements so that we can trigger an increased regional option to enhance digital participation in e-government. So now I'd like to give the floor to the first guest today from Estonia. He will be connecting remotely, and after that we'll start with a Q&A session with the members of the panel who are here with me in the room, as well as Dr. Chocobar from Peru. So Lucas, Undersecretary for Digital Transformation of the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications of Estonia, who is a referent on digital government. Lucas, the floor is yours. Good morning and thank you, pero voy a...
Hold on, let me just adjust the audio. So, thank you very much for having me. I want to share some of the thoughts that we've had on the topic of citizen participation and how it fits into our broader digital government framework. And I think there's a core truth that I want to start with, which is that after doing digital government for more than 20 years, one of the things we have over time started to take out is the word digital from government, in the sense that we really try to, we're trying to break the idea that digital government is something separate from government as a whole. And this is true in terms of everything, how we look at services. Today, the North Star of our digital government strategy is to focus on user services and raising user satisfaction services. And that isn't just a focus on digital, it's a focus really on all elements of whether those services meet the needs of citizens. But the reason it's done via digital government is because we have the channels, how people interact with the services. We have the data to measure whether people are actually getting the services they need. We have the technology and the tools to do user research, to continuously develop the service. And we have the infrastructure that allows services not just to be offered by the public sector, but to use the public sector as a platform for the private sector. And so what we see is that ultimately the people doing digital government, my team, our digital government agencies, the people responsible for technology in every area of government, they don't focus on e-government. They really are just focusing on providing good government services using digital tools. And I think we need to think about this same principle when we think about citizen participation and inclusiveness, which is that your e-participation can really only be as good as your participation and your inclusiveness as a whole. And I'd like to broaden the category and look at at e and online participation in three different dimensions. The first one is online voting. It's something that you would think, given the infrastructures and the technology of the digital age, would be very broadly available, and yet it isn't. Estonia, to this day, is the only country that regularly conducts its elections online. And I think that's in part because you have to get a lot of things right. You have to get the infrastructure right, online identity, voter register, the voting systems themselves, trust in all of that. But there isn't anything fundamentally technologically very difficult, and especially considering the very strong electoral commissions that you have across Latin America after constitutional reforms in the 80s and the 90s, there isn't any fundamental reason that you could not also have online voting in most Latin American countries. And the benefits on the inclusiveness really relate to the accessibility of the vote. And I'll use the case of Estonia to illustrate this. We're a very small country. We have fewer than 50 embassies and foreign representations. And yet Estonians regularly vote online from more than 100 countries. Similarly, we have rural areas. We're a smaller country physically than most Latin American countries. Even in our rural areas, which are ultimately fairly well connected to towns with roads, people who live more than a few kilometers from the town generally prefer to vote online because it's just much more convenient and easier. And if we then think about the geographical challenges of elections in Latin America, you can see the benefits there. And I know this isn't something that we usually talk about in the context of online participation, but we shouldn't forget it because ultimately voting and elections are the core of how democracies conduct themselves. What we haven't seen in Estonia, which I think is still for us a question in the future, is actually increasing the incidence and the frequency of voting by means of having online voting. So today we're still in the sort of the regular electoral cycles we have, which is to say national elections, local elections, in our case also for the European Parliament. We don't have Swiss-style referendums, but we have the technological capability today to have much more frequent consultation and binding consultation in the form of votes. Whether we do that or not is a political choice, but it's a possibility that's been created. We've seen other countries, and this brings us to the second bit, which is sort of softer forms of consultation, participatory governance, citizens participating in various consultative processes. There was a lot of optimism in Estonia, as I think globally, 10 or 15 years ago, about the potential contribution of electronic tools to participatory democracy. And I think to some extent there has been a fair amount of disappointment in that in the last decade, where the sort of most active participation we see is in quite unpleasant Facebook fora and conversations, and not necessarily in sort of the enlightened democratic discourse that we thought the digital age was going to bring. However, one element where digital government infrastructure does help with that is if you can properly identify your citizens and bring an element of accountability into the participatory fora. So the types of online conversations we have, including our petitioning environment, they work well because we know that the people who are participating there are Estonian citizens. They're generally participating under their real name, and that creates accountability and a feedback loop where you basically avoid some of the sort of less pleasant features of anonymous online conversations. And in particular, something that has sort of played an increasing role is online petitions, where in Estonia, as in many other countries, if you have a certain number of people signing a petition, that forces the issue into Parliament. And in our case, because of the strong electronic signature, when we have those signatures on a petition, we really know that those are real people. We don't have to worry about the challenges of verifying identity. And the last element I want to bring up is the question of openness in data. Because accountability can come through a whole lot of different channels. And one of the ways in which open data has contributed to accountability is put citizens in the position of really auditing the government and controlling what government is doing. Now, I don't need to tell you about the open data movement. That's quite global. But there's also, there are a lot of data that are never going to be open. They're going to remain partially closed because they're sensitive, because they're personal data. And here, one of the infrastructures that we provide is the ability for citizens to track what has been done with their data, what access has been made of their data, to see whether various public authorities have properly or improperly used personal data, and to see in a more general sense how it is that public services rely on different data sources. So we have transparency on the data schema, the data objects that are used and how public services are put together. And so you can combine both the individual view and what's happened to your data and this collective view of how the government is using data. And this allows the people who would sort of conduct supervision of the government, whether those are citizen journalists, whether those are anti-corruption campaigners, to really have access to a much larger wealth of information and ultimately hold government to account. And I think the point here is that these things are all complementary to sort of properly participative processes, participatory budgeting, planning processes where people can give their input. And it's important that we think about participation as being a full spectrum, from hard voting to open fora to also holding government to account through transparency when participation and following regulations fails, and that the sort of end outcome we're looking for is not one of e-participation or e-democracy, but democracy and participation and government transparency working well. And so there's really just going to be a technological component every step along the way.
¿Se escucha? Sí. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Lucas, for your presentation. And I think this links very well to the question that we'd like to ask our very renowned panelists today. To develop a good digital government, as it was said, you need a digital governance articulating players, policies, and resources and relations, making it possible to implement the strategies of the digital government. I'd like to ask you, starting with you, Pedro, how can you see this articulation in the Dominican Republic, and what are the main challenges that you can see to achieve it? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. In the name of the Dominican Republic, we would like to thank you for this invitation to participate in this 8th Ministerial Conference and all the support provided by ECLAC during this event. As regards governance, this is one of the most critical cross-cutting issues of governments and regions, to be able to implement what we call digital transformation. We're living at a time when countries, to have a social and economic growth that is sustainable, require to implement digital policies and be transformed digitally. In the Dominican Republic, in this administration, chaired by Bernabé, we find a large dissemination. There are multiple laws establishing various areas of the ICTs to various ministries and institutions, dozens of them, and you've been able to see them. There are dozens of decrees whereby the governmental Office for Information Communication Technologies is the operating branch. And we have over 10 decrees providing that governance to OCTIC in order to speed up the implementation process of technologies. Now, there are other ministries saying that there are other decrees saying that they are in charge. So we are in permanent conflict when sometimes we don't move forward. In view of this situation, where we can generate correct digital policies, we've grown asymmetrically. On the one hand, an institution may develop a standard model which deems correct. Another institution would do it on its own. We produce the regulations and the standards. We indicate the standard, but it goes into conflict. And we are faced with that terrible reality of decrees and laws. The President of our Republic created a cabinet for digital transformation. We created a 2030 agenda where we defined 7 axes on the agenda. And the most important one has to do with governance, to be able to define a framework so that the Dominican Republic can be inserted sustainably in this digital transformation. We started with governance. And that is why we have received the support of many institutions such as the EU, the IADB, and you, ECLAC, lately. In the past 3 months, we worked on a very interesting diagnosis that allowed even us in that process, thanks to ECLAC support, to identify more decrees that were there and that we didn't know about, and that would give governance to different areas. At present, thanks to your support and the results that you've indicated, we are working on an digital innovation and development draft of one single law, organizing all the decrees and laws in one single entity with a certain regulation. The President announced it last week. There is a dialogue gathering or table to promote all these policies. And there's a technical table for digital transformation where the civil society, the academia, citizens, and political parties, as well as the institutions that are working on technology, gather for 3 months, and that was the only table of reforms that had a full consensus, that reached full consensus as to what has to be done to advance in ICT. And that's why we have this bill that will be submitted to Parliament in the Dominican Republic, and we hope it be voted favorably. We would like this technological implementation to have the participation, or count on the participation of all citizens. Because if the digital policies that we develop do not have an impact on citizens, then we won't obtain any results. That's the path that we are carrying. It's all the governments in the region must strengthen the regulatory framework. We are also launching in the Dominican Institute of Telecom on the law jointly. At a certain point in time, we realized that it was convenient to have digital innovation and development law updating the telecom law that dates back to 1997. Under the law, there were some technological issues such as connectivity, fiber, and so on, which we can see in the telecom world, which aren't included under the law. And we are having regulations and other rules, but there is a bill that's practically ready that will be submitted to Parliament in the Dominican Republic so that we'll be able to deploy and implement new technologies such as 5G and to complete 4G and to continue advancing within the innovation environment. It's fundamental for us to continue developing the Dominican Republic socially and technologically. Thank you, Pedro, for sharing with us the experience of the Dominican Republic. As it was mentioned in the previous panel, it's one of the countries that has stressed digital transformation as one of its axes for its national development strategy, making this topic a cross-cutting topic to promote the development of your country. I would like to give the floor now to Virginia Pardo, the Director for the Information Society of the National Agency for E-Government and Information Society, AGESIC of Uruguay, who is hosting this meeting. We would like you to tell us about the challenges of digital governance in Uruguay. Thank you. Thank you, Valeria, for asking me to participate in this panel, and all of you for sharing this panel with us.
I think the question has to do with the need to articulate things to have a good digital government strategy. And this is as simple as what is our strategy like in 5 minutes? This is quite complicated, namely to speak about all the challenges. This is a strategy that has to have an area that is leader in digital government at national level, namely the concept of articulation. If we speak about this, this implies working side by side with all the stakeholders. There are different public agencies in charge of implementing services and adjust technologically to provide the quality required by individuals. The private sector, the technology assist in implementing solutions. The academia, civil society, the technical community, which helps us in the sense of best practices and how to do many of the things. So we are now celebrating the 15th anniversary of AGESIC, the e-government agency. This began as e-government and then evolved. We changed the name as things evolved. And one of the important aspects, the biggest effort of all the team and of all the agency is articulation. I would say that that's 80% of our work, namely articulation. This implies the major challenges, taking into account the major challenges. We have to generate trust. We are the technical benchmark regarding things that have to be done properly, and this generates trust. This has to do with solutions to assist the agencies to detect where the problems lie and which are those technological solutions that are required as an asset for the state, and that we shouldn't be implementing solutions for specific things. This has to do with a dialogue, with learning what the industry is offering. This is an ongoing and open dialogue with the technological industry. This also involves trust, to be open to see what work is being done in what fields, but also to build capacities and to implement sustainable solutions. The key for proper articulation is to have sustainable instruments. And over the past years, this has been our major challenge. And there is sustainability from the technical standpoint. We have to have solutions. And we have been speaking about solutions. These change all the time. The channels used by people for communication change very rapidly. Sometimes we think we have a very solid solution, and we thought we had a very solid solution 15 years ago. These have become obsolete. And this also involves high costs. This affects that aspect too. There can be cloud-based solutions, but these have the open solutions that are open source. These things have to be adaptable. So in order to advance, the government needs to have the support of the technological industry, which is the one that is at the forefront regarding these solutions. Articulation with them implies that the industry has to know where we are heading. If we don't know where we are heading, then we also want to advance knowing where the industry is heading. So this has to do with articulation with the private sector. In addition to that, where we're heading is where people need services most. Where do the priorities lie? Where is the demand? So we need to have a space for dialogue and interaction. We have to have a dialogue with the civil society. And how can we create a space for sustainability? We have permanent working group in order to have reference frameworks so as to define national strategies. So all these things imply that we have to have working groups together with the academia. Sustainability is also associated to capacity. And this is yet one further aspect we have been working on, namely generating resources and processes. We have to build capacities in the different agencies. There has to be a continuity despite changes in administration. So capacity building has to do for the public agencies, which are the ones in charge of leading and implementing solutions, and also among the people. So capacity building has to be done in articulation with the academia, with the education sector, which are the ones who can really help us have that critical mass. That is part of the process that we understand is a key to success and one of the challenges we face to have that governance. Thank you very much, Virginia, and thank you for the reference to the sustainability of the initiatives and to tackle all these issues as a state policy and generating trust and having a permanent dialogue with all the stakeholders. So thank you for touching upon these topics. We'll now give the floor to the members of the panel to see how we can go about this articulation. Ana Karina Rodriguez will now have the floor. She is the Undersecretary for Services and Digital Country of the Secretary for Public Innovation from Argentina. Thank you very much for your invitation and for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I was listening to the different speakers, and I think that one of the important things that we can draw in terms of conclusions is that we have many common challenges. Articulation is of essence. And regarding how we work in our country, we have an ongoing articulation. At the same time, we perceive that this articulation is what allowed us during the pandemic to do efficient management of the demands of the citizens, because we are ready to maintain that articulation. So there are two things that are essential in this regard. How do agencies view us regarding the trust that we can generate from the position? And if we sustain that citizens are at the core and not the agencies or the different levels of national, subnational governments. So what we have to do is how we implement public policies. How do we articulate things in order to be able to sustain and respond to the demands of citizens? During the pandemic, we were able to articulate the international credentials for COVID-19 together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Health, with the Ministry of Innovation, the ANAC, which is an association in charge of the airport administration. So all these agencies met to discuss which was the best way to discuss things. This is because the Ministry of Health already work with an interoperable system, namely all the people who are vaccinated in the country had their information located in one same place. So there were different challenges. How do we articulate things? And to achieve this, we have to work together and reach consensus. We have to be aware that we all have to work with the aim of making citizens perceive that we are paving the way to make things possible. So digitalization gives us this opportunity. We can work in a cross-cutting manner between the different agencies together with the different subnational governments. We worked together, and this type of articulation was very fruitful. In Argentina, we have one single app. A while ago, I was listening to the presentation on smart cities, and there's one single app that contains all the services of the documentation provided by the states. We shouldn't ask the citizens to have 10 or 20 apps and duplicate efforts. So this is all located in one single site. This implies ongoing articulation between the different agencies of the national government to make this information available. Some time ago, on November the 2nd, we launched TINA, which is our bot. This is the only bot of a national state. We include several different procedures, and this is increasing constantly because citizens have to go to one single site. And the state has to be transparent. The citizens don't need to understand all the different divisions and agencies you have at national or subnational level. So when we're able to make this flow, when this bears fruit, then we'll be having an efficient state which is empathic and close to the citizens. And that is a major challenge we have. Thank you very much, Anna Karina. Data interoperability is very important, and also the one-stop shop is very important, so that the state is close to the citizens. We'll now give the floor to Mariska Chocola Reyes, who will be joining us from Cusco. Marushka, the same question is one we would like to ask you. Tell us about the articulation of digital governance in Peru and the major challenges faced to achieve this. You have the floor. Thank you very much. I'm in Cusco. I am delighted to participate in this ministerial meeting. I'd like to thank ECLAC for the invitation. I'd like to tell you that in Peru we have 35 million inhabitants, but 19 million inhabitants are connected somehow or other, particularly through mobile phones. And from these 35 million, a large percentage speaks Quechua. Now, And this governance scheme is also allow us to be able to increase digital citizenship. Now, how have we advanced along this path? First of all, we have managed to have regulations that were enacted and have this capacity, this ruling capacity, like Valeria was saying. She spoke about governance regarding the competent agency for this is there was a law enacted or regulations enacted on national to regulate all this. So this is a public-private form of government. So we have strategic governance also. Now, all this is based on public policies. One is policy number 35 of the Information Society, where all the powers of the state and the government and the civil society and the academia and the private sector in general and the citizens are considered for defining the public policies. And the second one is a strategic plan of the government that takes into account digital transformation. And national strategy number 4 is to make these services available to the citizens. Then we have the government policies. Governments change every 5 years in Peru. There's axis number 8, that is digital transformation with equity. And in terms of the strategic line, we're working on the digital transformation of the country. This was announced by the President of the Republic last week in the summit for the digital government of Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, this strategic component, this ruling component, is sustained in an executive agency. We looked at the models such as Colombia and Uruguay that has an important e-government agency, and Dominican Republic. All these countries that are strengthening this type of governance are the ones we took as example. We launched the National E-Government Platform. This was so necessary during the pandemic.
The National Center for Data, the National Digital Platform, have brought about all this and allowed us to do this exercise of governance from these perspectives. To conclude my first intervention in answering this question, this has allowed us to do two things. In the first place, to reach every single corner of Peru. We don't have we have tried to provide connectivity to all places in Peru. Over 97% of our citizens can connect through their mobile phones. And we have been able to have interventions at international level. In the United Nations, there is a strong commitment to follow the way of many countries in the region that have been working on this. And it's been indicated also that that we have gone up 23 positions in the ranking according to the World Bank. So it's fundamental to increase indicators, but how many of those indicators benefit our people? This is what I could share with you, Valeria. Thank you.
Esa intervención. Y vamos ahora.
Thank you. We are now going to have a second round of questions. Pedro, I'd like to ask you, as the director of OCTIC, how much do you mention, what do you mention? You mentioned that you have to be proactive, data promoted, and opened by default. How do you see the role of inclusion and the e-participation in these dimensions, and which, according to you, are the main challenges that the region identifies to involve the people in electronic consultations and other electronic ways of participation? Thank you. That would require 10 minutes to start answering and put it in context due to the challenges that we have. I understand that we have challenges in common in all Latin America to a higher or lesser degree. Some have advanced positively in the past 10 years, like Uruguay, Chile, Colombia, Argentina. But we are learning from the experiences that our brother countries have accumulated. And that's why we are in the process of exchanging and cooperating to reduce implementation times and comply with our goals. The most important thing is that citizens participate, that the society as a whole and its institutions like unions and the academia have an active participation to produce public policies. That is why, for example, in the Dominican Republic, as I mentioned, we were given an award by the ILO this year precisely in citizen participation, because we built it on the framework, within the framework that all citizens, our main provinces which we visited, we would take down our ideas and the priority projects that the Dominican Republic must implement to be transformed digitally. Not only the government, but all the society, the private sector. We found that the private sector was much more advanced than the government. So our main challenge is to get up to the level of the private sector, and that's one of the areas that we are working as a priority. Connectivity, well, we're not going to be able to reduce the gap or to have a better and higher participation of all citizens if we don't reduce the digital gap. To that end, we are working very hard to try and connect all the country through the telecom company managing the optic fiber. We are now into a third stage of fiber to have a ring that will allow us to have transportation and to reach faraway regions, poor regions that suffer this digital gap the most. Thanks to satellite technology, we'd like to take advantage of it because there are and there always be areas that are difficult to get to. Now, satellite technology will allow us to reach those communities where there are schools, and those schools must be connected digitally. Thus, we'll be able to strengthen the capacity of students and teachers, also the police and so on. All the institutions must be connected so that they can improve the services they provide to citizens. Likewise, because we are concerned about the question of participation, last year we created a portal. It's a single transparency portal. There was a serious problem of transparency in the Dominican Republic. There's a question of corruption, and our president understood that we had to tell our citizens what we are doing, how we are investing the resources that we receive. That's why we've created the single transparency portal so that in a centralized manner, citizens can see what we do, but not just a photograph, but data that they can consume, that they can download, and that they can use. We are also working together with the IADB and other organizations, the question of open data. We are about to launch a unique open data portal. It's important for citizens to participate and to share the data that we've got, not only on the public sector, but also the private sector, because at the end of the day, they play a fundamental role. We also understand that more citizen consultations and more forums should be implemented so that they can contribute actively. The challenge doesn't lie only with the government, it's everyone's challenge, and that's why the equal participation of all sectors is fundamental. To that end, likewise, we worked on the simplification of proceedings and regulatory reforms all along last year. So we went up to Parliament so that through the Competitive Council of the Dominican Republic promoting foreign investment in the Republic and the General Directorate of Public-Private Partnership and Technical Advance, we produced a project called Zero Red Tape, Zero Bureaucracy. We were able to reduce only to 305 most critical proceedings. We've identified that 157 were a priority. So we had to be able to obtain better conclusion and improve citizen resources. And among those 137 proceedings, we have passport proceedings, single window for investments, and that's transcendental because we want investors who come to our republic must have simple processes. We had processes in place that would take years, a process that would take 2 years that could be done by anyone in the world wishing to invest in our country, could do so in 60 days or 180 days because there are multiple regulations, environmentally speaking, that we must comply with, and also in other areas. But we're going to reduce our time significantly. We also have a sanitary record from 60 days to 14 days, and now we want all products coming from the United States authorized by the FDA, if they've already been certified in the countries of origin with certifications and regulations that are highly effective, we shouldn't submit them to or subject them to an additional regulation. Therefore, we're going to improve internal issues to generate competitiveness to our producers. We can't allow for a foreign product to have access to our market and not protect our local market. But we are working together. So we understand that we also have to work harder in digital capacities. It's not only for civil servants, and we've been doing that since last year, but of citizens. If we don't strengthen the digital skills of our citizens, it's going to be far difficult for them to be inserted and consume and contribute to the digitalization challenges. Thank you, Pedro, for tabling all these topics: access to information, the importance of data to participate, and also digital inclusion, which is an essential element. Virginia, you can have the floor now to deal with participation and the challenges. Thank you. The summary that you made at the beginning of a question, there is a key word, and it's a question of inclusion. I think inclusion is something that we have to focus on because it's the fundamental principle of all digital policies. It is something that we've already seen in all our talks here. We have to ensure access and use of information because it pertains to people. And it is in this concept of inclusion that we have a very important fundamental right, which is citizen participation. I think that right, which means to be integrated in society, in a society that is more and more connected, where we have technological opportunities, to have in mind that technologies can allow us to have more inclusion and the right to participation. In our agency, we are working in a quite favorable situation because of connectivity in Uruguay, so we can use the digital participation as an amplifier of presential participation. We shouldn't forget that we have to have a dialogue in person as well. Now, for that inclusion to be really effective, we have to think about how we are offering those tools and those spaces from the state, from the government, the design, open by default, proactive, all those standards and good practices and guidelines that we discussed in our first part, the challenges of the digital world. All these tools must comply with all those standards and openness. There is a proactivity to make services closer to citizens. And this is part of our working line that we are working on. Mobile access by default. We've got our cell phones in our pockets, so information can easily get to us through a text message or how a certain service must be rendered. I have to have it accessible, close at hand, and that's the basic part of citizen participation, to be informed and have access to information. There are still important barriers at regional level and also in Europe to have easy access that can be readable, legible to all parts of the country. So there is an important step forward moving towards that participation, to have accessibility law that forces all the state and the private sector to comply with international standards, making it accessible to everyone. And something else that you said, the skills and competences that people have for that participation, those are two approaches that we must consider, that digital participation is not only a question of participation. Of course, it must comply with many quality standards, so that's not become a barrier. But there are skills that people must have to be incorporated, to socialize, to interact, to dialogue, to contribute, and to comment in a digital environment. The idea is to interact and issue your opinion, because many times we are used to, at cultural level, the way we interact in person, but virtuality also has its rules and challenges, and that involves a lot of training and awareness. But organizations must also open up spaces, and you have to be prepared, because as you said in the UN, in this new report that appeared a couple of months ago, of the ranking and also the concepts behind the e-government assessment, highlighted the question of digital participation in such a way that it included it in the index of public services. And it's a 35% weight. It's not only in there, but it's an important factor, because it's understood that in the good provision of public services, digital participation ranks high. So we have to take into account that information must be accessible, it must be understood, and must be obtained. We must have feedback from citizens, and to listen and to respond, and how these spaces for dialogue and consultation can lead to decision making. We must have the capacity to react and respond and improve services and make strategies on the basis of that. Participation isn't efficient, so that's part of the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Very important what you said regarding clear language. This is also implied. Ana Karina, you now have the floor. And can you please add on to this regarding the Argentine experience? Well, looking into some of the comments made by Pedro and Virginia, we have open portals, we have platforms for citizen consultation, we have plans that have to do with open government, where there is participation of civil society and different agencies supported by the Innovation Secretariat. And there's a lot of participation in those spaces, but these are not fully democratic, not as much as we would like, not because there is no willingness on behalf of the agencies or lack of openness, but rather what is the motivation of the citizens. So are citizens do they have the capacity to start queries and to look at the data? So as we evolved, and when Virginia started, said we called us first e-government. Well, in 2003, you also called ourselves e-government. Today, we speak about digital government. We speak about data governance. So in that sense, we also have to look at e-participation. Today, regarding natural language processing in our bot, there's a lot of information that citizens leave there. For example, participation in terms of claims and complaints. So that is a challenge we have. How do we start taking those data into account? Of course, anonymously. So this is maybe a more direct form of participation, and we're not considering that in our measurements. Maybe we are considering measurements only for a public that has the adequate skills. And e-participation is not as democratic as we'd like, maybe. So through natural language processing, through the bots, we have here the opportunity of identifying the requirements of the citizens, what they're asking for. And this also happens with the social media that the agencies have. Today in Argentina, agencies have their own networks. They provide information through those paths. And citizens also express their problems, concerns, and claims. So we have to see not only the channels we have, but what do we do with the information we receive. Virginia said, as she said, we have to be ready so that all the claims made by citizens can be responded by us. So we have to have that data governance in order to analyze this information and to be able to make decisions that are evidence-based. Evidence is not always about the tools we consider formally, so opening data, public consultation, and open government. But there are other spaces where citizens inform about their claims, and this depends on us whether we can identify where these are. This has to do with inclusion from the different standpoints and places to reduce the gap, the gender gap, the disability gap, and so many more gaps. We have to provide answers in many of these fields. Thank you, Anna Karina, for that reflection, and I agree that there is still room for exploring new forms of participation and how to expand this participation to include other forms of deliberative democracy using digital tools. Marushka, you now have the floor for some final comments. I'm sorry, the audio is not good. There is the audio is not so good. So the idea, I will do my best. There are a series of communication mechanisms and digital strategies that they have to be based on what is simpler for the citizens. In Peru, we're working on a national strategy for participation. This is based on 3 axes: information, public consultation, and innovation and participation. In the innovation channel, we have open data platform, and we also have a georeference e-platform. This allows to include 10,000 public services, and we have about 4.5 million visits. Regarding the access to public information, all these are forms that citizens have to access. In the second line, we launched the first national survey on digital transformation. About 12,000 people participated. We also launched a brief survey using short codes through mobile phones. This was through people who did not have smartphones or option for connectivity. I'm sorry, the audio quality is very poor. We included in a site all the norms which people can have access to. These are channels that are made available to the citizens. In terms of participation and innovation, I am now in Cusco, about to inaugurate the Digital Transformation Laboratory of Cusco. We have innovation laboratories in different parts of the country. There are 70 laboratories in the country. These have been done through the participation of the civil society, the state, and the academia. And we have followed models, as I was saying, used in Colombia and Chile and other countries. Today we have a law that allows us to have new spaces for innovation. And finally, the National E-Government Network. And I would like to conclude saying the following. We have made a query on digital rights. I'm sorry, the audio is so poor. We took the best practices used in many countries in order to adapt these to our country. We implemented observatories that encourage the citizens to participate, because whatever we do should be useful for people. We also try to improve the mechanisms for participation. We would want to promote open data. Even the public, the private sector can also participate in this. And finally, as was also commented, we want to have spaces for innovation and e-participation. But we should also maintain in-person participation, because we have to encourage contact with the citizens. I'm sorry for the poor quality. So thank you, Marushka. Before closing, I would like to give my colleague Alejandra Nasser 2 minutes, who's a specialist in e-government. I'd like her to tell us about the history of e-government and smart government, which we hope can be a resource that will be of use to all of you. Alejandra, you have 2 minutes. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Would like to take this opportunity of officially launching this biblio-guide launched together with ECLAC, together with the Library Santa Cruz, in the framework of the cooperation between ECLAC and the Republic of Korea. The purpose of this site is to gather all the essential and structuring models for the development of an e-government under a digital governance model. This is an ECLAC model that we are proposing to the countries of the region. This was already applied in Costa Rica, and we're now working with Dominican Republic, and this is available in this biblio guide. This also shows important elements to evolve from a digital government to a smart government, considering the cultural elements and governance. So this biblio guide is available There are several resources that includes multimedia, publications, papers that you can read, examples of regional and extra-regional cases. And let me tell you that next year, between August the 2nd and September the 13th, we'll be having the first version of the virtual course that has the same name, From the Digital Government to a Smart Government. So the registration will be open as from next week. You will be able to visit this biblioguide, biblioguia.ecepal.org. This is a website, so you're all welcome to visit this website. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alejandra, and you're all invited to use this digital resource. I would like to thank the members of this distinguished panel for their participation. I'd also like to thank the government of Estonia, who through Lucas participated today. We know there is a very important time difference. I think Estonia is a world benchmark on all these fields. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the members of the panel who are here too. A big round of applause for all of you. So thank you very much. We now have a break, a coffee break, but prior to that, I would like to ask the heads of delegation to stay on so we can take the official picture. Please come up here to the stage and to please turn off the screen. I'm asking the technical guys. Thank you.
Así que jefes de delegación, jefes y jefas de delegación, por favor, acérquense al escenario. A ver si están por allí para tomarse las fotos. Muy amable, autoridades de CEPAL. Están muy tímidos. Sí, jefe de delegación. Eso me dijeron, pero... Sí. Ajá. El equipo de CEPAL también puede acercarse, por supuesto. Señoras y señores, vamos a continuar. Antes de continuar precisamente con la siguiente mesa.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start the new or the next panel, and we are going to have a very special moment. We're going to approve the digital agenda for Latin America and the Caribbean, the ELAC 2024, as well as the Montevideo Declaration. So we would like to call Mr. Luis Yáñez, Secretary of ECLAC, Heber Paguas, Executive Director of AGESIC from Uruguay, Lucia Escudo, Officer of Economic Affairs from the Gender Division of ECLAC, Feliz Fernandez Shaw, Director for Latin America and the Caribbean and Relations with all overseas countries and territories of the Director General for International Partnership of the European Commission, Jorge Cerul, Regional Manager of the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF, Sergio Abreu, Secretary General of the Latin American Integration Association, ALADI, Federico Bonaglia, Deputy Director of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Development Center, Claudio Araya San Martin, and the Secretary for Telecommunications of the Ministry of Transport and Communications of Chile.
Faltó una silla.
Ya vamos a conseguirla.
Arrancamos derecho con... Sí, claro, se voy a probar. Y después ya arrancamos con el seco.
Y bueno, ya estamos listos, preparados.
So we are ready, and we would like to give the floor to Mr. Luis Yáñez. Thank you very much, and a very good morning. This is the last panel that brings us together after 3 days of work. We have presented a document, a digital path for sustainable development. It was presented by ECLAC, and we've had 3 working tables where we listen to the civil society, the private sector, the governments, etc. And within this framework of cooperation and alliance, we have firstly to frame this event, and the first framing is to confirm in this plenary the approval of the Montevideo Declaration and the digital agenda that were discussed at length during a process that started several months ago. It was directed at first by Ecuador, and when we arrived in Montevideo, the elected chair, Uruguay, started directing the debates in order to implement this agenda that has objectives and that has some terms, as well as the Montevideo Declaration that is framing this agenda. So I would like to submit the agenda by acclamation, as we usually do, and I would like to ask for a round of applause to signal that we have approved the agenda.
El segundo punto de enmarque de esta conversación.
The second point to frame this conversation is related to leadership. During the first session, the first day, we chose Uruguay, we elected Uruguay as the chair for this 8th conference. And now we would like to confirm with you the other countries that are going to accompany Uruguay in this effort from Montevideo and Santiago, so to speak, in the work of the board. Uruguay will chair, and then Argentina and Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, the Dominican Republic, and Chile will be alongside Uruguay. We are going to leave an open space because we didn't have participants from the Caribbean countries, and we are going to leave some chairs open so that this board has representatives of all territories and all realities of this heterogeneous Latin America and Caribbean. And again, I would like you to give a round of applause to the elected members of the board. So we have an agenda, we have leadership, we have responsibilities and terms. And now let's start the conversation on the mechanisms and modalities of cooperation by giving, in the first place, the floor to Uruguay, to Herbert, as a president of this conference and this space, so that he tells us how his leadership, or Uruguay's leadership, will be, what will be the spaces, and what are the challenges in building alliances to implement the digital agenda.
Muchísimas gracias por la...
Thank you very much for your introduction. And of course, my congratulations to those who will be accompanying us during the next term. And also, of course, those that will come next, our brothers from Chile. In order to talk about cooperation, we have to do more or less the same that we do when we talk about digital government and digital transformation. There are some examples that humanize cooperation and digital transformation. We see that there are examples that go hand in hand. And for example, we could mention in our region the COVID passport. We have forgotten it, but 1 year ago, when we started opening borders, and especially in Europe, they started implementing the Green Pass, we, in our region, saw that there was a challenge. What could we do so that our people, our citizens, once borders opened, they could get through the borders? Well, in this case, international cooperation, after several bilateral meetings, allowed Uruguay and then other countries to have a passport that was standardized by the regulations of the European Union. That is to say, people who went to Europe were able to travel with a vaccination certificate issued here and vice versa. Another example, quite recent, that we have discussed in these panels is a cross-border signature. International cooperation in this regard forces us to work, for example, on cross-border signatures in order to reach other regions in the world. That a document signed in Uruguay is valid in Argentina and also in Mercosur, and vice versa, is a big progress in digital transformation and also an example of international cooperation between countries, and also between bodies such as ours. I believe that the multi-stakeholder approach is important for this kind of cooperation. The artificial intelligence observatories in the region, as well cybersecurity observatories in the region, but what we also want to achieve with this cooperation is sustainable development, public policies in our country that belong to the whole region. And this is basically what we have been discussing these last days, and that's the purpose of our joint work. Open loop in security, data protection, once again, cooperation for data protection. Our countries have progressed almost hand in hand with regard to data protection regulations with similar agreements, and also we have signed agreements with the European Union, the C108 firstly, and then the C180 plus that was ratified later by Uruguay, and this is another example of good practices in digital transformation. And of course, the objectives 30 and 31 of the new ELAC agenda aligned with the alliances to reach the objectives and the SDGs. So we are all very tired and want to take the floor much longer because we have been working a lot during these last 3 days. These are examples of humanization of cooperation and humanization of digital transformation, and they set the path that we as a region should follow. As a region, as a working group, and also as a group of cooperation and collaboration. Thank you very much. And I would like to point out that yesterday, Uruguay led the first meeting in which in the afternoon we had a multi-stakeholder discussion on the elements of cooperation that will be part of the working plan 2224, which are in line to what the chair just suggested. ECLAC is the technical secretariat of this space. This is the 8th meeting. However, this space has a special feature. It is probably one of the intergovernmental meetings of ECLAC in which the multi-stakeholder expression becomes stronger and more obvious and more binding, because here we have civil society, the academia, the private and public society that are pushing this agenda. So my question for Lucia, which is a senior officer of ECLAC in Economic Affairs. What's your reflection in this regard from the point of view of ECLAC, the implementation of the agenda? How does it impact this multi-stakeholder approach in our institution, which is a novelty? Thank you very much, and a very good morning, everyone. And also a special greeting to my colleagues in the panel. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for the approval of this agenda, which is more ambitious. And let me remind you that this intergovernmental space has had several meetings. For example, in 2013, on the other side of the square, we discussed a similar agenda. And among the objectives that were approved today, there is one more push for this digital agenda that is convening us. And also, in terms of cooperations, puts us on an equal footing with other regions. We heard during the first panel that there are challenges and opportunities that are similar to those of other regions, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean. And as Everba was just said, the pandemic that we forget from time to time, because now we are traveling again, and now we are coming back in our everyday life to some pre-pandemic activities. The pandemic showed us that we have similar problems or common problems at a global level, and this is a challenge to close the digital divide, and also a challenge with regard to cooperation. The pandemic was a challenge indeed with regard to the dialogue between many players, but now we have a transition towards green energies and a digital transition. And I would say, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, that last week we had the regional conference on women in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the inclusion we discussed was inclusion of everyone, men and women. And yesterday during the panel we said no one should be left behind, not only closing affordability gaps, but also analyzing accessibility to see who is not having access at the moment to the offers that are there. Some people are able to board the boat. This is an old metaphor, and some others are not. And this alliance, therefore, should be made between countries of this region, but also with other regions. These challenges belong to a vast and ambitious agenda, therefore. And finally, another point, the intersectional challenge that comes up with this agenda and other intergovernmental spaces in which ECLAC acts, and where we discuss, as we said, with other governments, and the discussion is not only between governments but also with the academia, in the case of the gender agenda, with feminists, for example, that have been discussing certain issues during these last years. And once again, Wagner yesterday pointed out that it is necessary to put up the digital agenda, thinking of the necessary intersections and those that should be included in every challenge, the 5G, the extension of the physical or broadband or mobile broadband, etc. So I leave you with these two ideas: transitions and alliances beyond regions and beyond countries, and also the intersectionality that should be our objective. What I did not say when I gave Lucia Cudo the floor was that the Regional Conference on Women many years ago discussed information society and digital access. So there are convergence processes, as you very well pointed out. And Lucia had a very important role at that conference. When we read the document that the Secretary General introduced, there was a column that showed the European agenda. Europe adapted to the digital era, and among the priorities of this agenda, there are some ambitions and objectives that we also see in our own roadmap. So I would like to ask Felix Fernandez Shaw, Director for Latin America and the Caribbean and Relations with Overseas Countries and Territories of the Director General for International Partnership of the European Commission, a long title, about this coincidence in objectives and also spaces of cooperation and collaboration for Latin America and the Caribbean based on their own digital agenda. Felix? Thank you very much. Indeed, I think that by saying Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the European Union, we can abbreviate the title. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this final table of the conference. When I read the declaration that we just adopted, I go back to what I said on Wednesday morning and what you just said. I think that I am going to take this declaration, I'm going to traduce it in every language, English, French, Estonian, Slovakian, and we're going to propose it as an agenda for Europe, because the four components I see here are the same ones, and we have the same agenda. Therefore, I believe that we have a great space in which we can work jointly and a very significant opportunity. As I said, we have the summit between the European Union and the Caribbean and Latin America in 2023. And hopefully with this agenda at hand, we will be able here and in Latin America and the Caribbean, I mean in Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean, to present all this as an opportunity. Coming from where I come and working in other regions, what happens is that many times we point out to what is not working, to what goes wrong. And now that we are always talking about classifications and elimination of teams, well, the truth is that Latin America is in a very good position because, of course, there are things that don't work, but also in Europe, this is the case. So if we compare Latin America to the rest of the world, well, there's no point for comparison. So what I would like to do is to take to the summit, as I said the other day, a presentation of Latin America and the Caribbean, that they explain Europe what their agenda is. And Europe is going to say, well, but this sounds very good. And looking at this agenda, we see that we are talking about the same things in digital and telecommunications matter. Investments and PPPs and productive alliances between society, the government, enterprises, because it's necessary to have a lot of investment, technology, rules, and training. And this cannot be done in a disorganized manner. It has to be done in a reasonably orderly manner. And I believe that in this agenda, Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean are going to coincide. So we are preparing the summit, and we are proposing the Latin American and Caribbean partners to submit investment projects with a comprehensive view, as the declaration states, and as the digital agenda of Latin America and the Caribbean states. We need public and private investments, financing, and also technology. We all know what we need. And the European Union has to be ready to take the first step if there is an investment opportunity such as this one. Why? Well, because if we look at the world at large, in very few opportunities the European Union will have a partner like Latin America and the Caribbean that is looking at digitalization with the same principles and ideas that coincide so much with those of the EU. And if we look at the political situation at a world level, we also understand that Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean should work more closely. And this is what I believe we should do. The European Commission, as you know, is preparing a digital alliance from the EU and Latin America with investment elements and also contacts between enterprises, startups. And we are going to propose the famous VELA, which has been very interesting and is a matter of cooperation, and all states in Latin America and the Caribbean should have access to this program. And also Copernicus can provide a lot of data for investments and also for public policies decisions. And what I would really like is that all of you help us so that the heads of state of Latin America and the Caribbean explain the heads of state of the European Union. You should look no further. This is the agenda in which it is really worth investing, because it's an agenda that belongs to all of us, our agenda and yours. As you know, Europe is not only a bit disconcerted with the World Cup, because some Europeans won't be there, others will, yes. We are not going to start there because this is an excluding discourse. But Europe at this time is distracted in other topics, and we read all this in the media every day. But Latin America and the Caribbean is still by its side, or the other way around. So this agenda, well, we shouldn't discuss the thematic priorities because we have agreement there. What are the investment projects in Latin America on the table that Latin America in the next 5 years is going to put on the table? Because Latin America has already prepared them in Uruguay, in Panama, in Colombia. Everybody knows what has to be done. And I think that this is the time not to go to Europe, or that Europe comes, as we always said, in an attitude of cooperation for development, which I don't think is the right attitude for Latin America, but with an attitude of productive investment, as well as technological investment and social as well. I took part in another panel, and our moderator, Jorge Negrete, mentioned several literary writings. And now I'm going to close with another literary quote, not of it's the same high level, but it's a very interesting novel that I would recommend, which is entitled If You Tell Me Come, I Will Leave Everything, but Tell Me Come. And this is what we should achieve next year between Latin America and the Caribbean. We have to meet and we have to work together in this agenda, which has so many complexities, but also so much future for both regions. Sorry.
Muchas gracias al director para.
Thank you very much to the director. CAF on its side has a roadmap and a digital agenda based on infrastructure and digital services. So we would like to listen to Jorge, who is the regional manager for Latin America, that will talk about the implementation of the digital agenda on behalf of the Development Bank of Latin America. Thank you very much. I would like to greet our president and assistant president. I told them that I was coming here, and they told me, Jorge, this is our agenda. We are a Latin American and Caribbean Development Bank, and therefore our bank is for Latin Americans and Caribbeans, and what the region decides is our orientation. In March, we decided to capitalize a bank with $7 billion, and then the situation in Chile improved from a shareholders' point of view, and now we have two paths ahead. The economic reactivation of Latin America and the Caribbean, and also to have it as a green bank. And digitalization is very important. Why? Well, there are some basic and simple things that our experts have already mentioned and ratified. It is clear that in order to achieve the 2030 objectives in decarbonization, 15% of what is required to reach the goals will be achieved through digitalization in Latin America. We have the temptation of mentioning what is still to be done, and we can tell you, however, about what the bank can do. For example, investing $3.7 billion during the last decade in various areas, infrastructure, but other areas as well. When we have 3,400 kilometers in the province of Santa Fe in Argentina, what we are doing is connectivity for the schools of Santa Fe. Same thing with big projects for the region, like the Humboldt cable that we are trying to promote from Asia to South America in an effort of regional integration and also extra-regional integration. And we are bringing then not only a cable but a big opportunity of access for the whole region. And with regard to artificial intelligence, we also think of how we can contribute to the gender perspective, because we are using mechanisms that will allow for the automation of gender violence claims. Now, what's our agenda for our future? It's this one. How can we contribute to this agenda better? Well, there are two fundamental aspects in this region. The innovation ecosystem is growing at an enormous speed. We have unicorns every day, and we give examples to the rest of the world. Now, the problems we should focus on in the region are basically the same. We have an infrastructure and an access problem. These are the two problems on which we should concentrate. All of us around these tables have the possibility of making contributions of some sort. We would make a big mistake if we continue to talk about our own plans, what one of us does. So today we are talking about capabilities with regard to the digital agenda that we are developing throughout the region to say, look what we can do. How this can contribute to the common agenda. This is the objective. We are not going to say we are going to continue doing things. We are going to ask you, how can the CAF, like the Latin American Bank, a Latin American Bank for Latin Americas and a Caribbean countries, can contribute further to the agenda? And this is what we are trying to do here. We want to celebrate and work.
Muchas gracias a la CAF.
Thank you, CAF. We know that micro and SMEs are a high percentage of companies in the region, that they provide 60% of employment and account for only 25% of product. Aladi has experience, has work done, has innovated around transboundary e-commerce. And today we have Sergio Abreu, Secretary General of the Latin American Integration Association, Aladi. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for convening me to this subject. I have a very good sense of humor. Without humor, you will be a loser, not just in elections, but in other fields as well. There was a man from Catalonia who took the fast train, and he was very pessimistic about it. Halfway, he got off the train, but the other one came very fast, so he sat next to another man, and he said, "Tell me, where are you going, sir?" He says, "I'm going to Madrid. And you?" "I'm going to Barcelona." "How come? This is technology. You go to Madrid, I go to Madrid, you go to Barcelona, and we go on the same train." So what does it mean? We still do not know where we're going to. The train is important, but where are we heading to? It has a lot to do with political goodwill. It should be more harmonious, more well-developed. At the level of Aladi, we have 13 countries. See how important instruments are. Out of the 13 countries, including Mexico, South America, plus Cuba and Venezuela. So we need to organize different integration policies, cooperation policies, modernity, around a political work that sometimes does not gather the same kind of enthusiasm or understanding on the part of countries. Of course, leadership plays an important role, but there is also asymmetry. In Aladi, I'm telling this experience very comfortably. What are we doing? And they ask me at home, "What are you doing, Dad?" "I work for Aladi." "And what is it for? Is it useful?" Maybe this is a question you yourselves have asked. But Aladi has a legal system that no other structure has. It allows countries to have partial agreements, I mean the 13 countries, and they can choose the subjects like market access or priorities for them, and among them we have the digital issue. Otherwise, in the global decisions of the blocs, we will have different strategic positions, rivalries, and so on. So at the General Secretariat, I asked the people, well, what about a digital challenge? We have that every single month. And this is causing me shocks. I have many scars. You have no hair, but my hair has many scars. When I go back and remember all that has happened, and I had so much more hair at that time, a different color in addition. When you see the way you've come through, like the Uruguay GATT round, then I went to Morocco, I negotiated, but this was not part of the agenda. Digital things did not exist. There were no services, there were limitations in terms of property rights. But at the time, we focused on agriculture or textiles. But today, when you are in Eladi and you talk about integration, you see new instruments that are very visible, very important. And so we wonder how much is a country negotiating within the country, within the region, using this instrument or using other instruments. How much does the European Union trade in intra-trade? 60%, or Asia 50%. So what is the meaning of all that in terms of digital instruments? What is it that comes along with it? It comes along with investment, trade, employment, and social peace. We are in the most unequal continent worldwide. We have all kinds of difficulties. I'm not being a pessimistic, I'm just being realistic. But the digital technology is advancing at a very high speed. So we decided to organize our activities around three actions: to promote electronic trade, to have Latin SMEs platforms. Any type of entrepreneur can use a cell phone and access information on trade preferences using the right algorithms. In addition, we have training systems, all free of charge, and e-commerce is included, and anything that is connected to logistics in a digital manner. And this leads to the competitiveness of countries in the international trade market. So if you have a problem at a border, you travel a lot, so you know about it. We need to have some information. If you have this, to cross a border in this world of large companies, 2/3 of world trade is within the companies. The vertical integration of such companies who want to be competitive in digital matters, in smart ports, in green ports, and how much time it takes for them to go from one point to another. I'm referring to the northern hemisphere, more precise. So we are always looking for instruments, digital self-image, recognition of digital signatures. Even with the Postal Union of the Americas, we want them to participate in that old model, but also as a logistics center. And then we produce a diagnosis. The digital economy, technological infrastructure, connectivity, access to internet, paperless trade, electronic invoices, SMEs, and digital world. What is the conclusion then? The digital system is so important that it not only changes the global world, the power world, because if you think that there is one gentleman who bought Twitter in $44 billion, the social networks will be in the hands of one single private individual. There is a crisis in terms of governance, in terms of legal security. So we are not certain about what's going to happen. What is that concept of public policy? Is it still alive? With digitalization, this may fall in the hands of a private individual or a group of companies that hold power in a very subjective manner. And let's come to Latin America now, as an example. I am politically incorrect. Latin America has no telephone. I told Joseph, if I want to call Brussels, I use a phone. Now, the voice of Latin America and the Caribbean, does it have a telephone? Does it have Facebook? Is there an authority to say we'll meet tomorrow or day after? I'm not criticizing, this is the reality. And we see that it all depends on the political will of countries in specific issues, where they face a challenge, and that is social inclusion. We are a very unequal continent. We have complex education features, and in addition, we have this pressure from the technological standpoint. So this strategy of our region must have at least some coincidence or participation of political will before we start wondering who's the winner, who's the loser, is he my friend or not in terms of national elections. And I feel something that is not very correct. I think human rights are the same as the left. They are human rights, whether you're right or left. In digital spheres, we are losing our awareness, our intimacy, our privacy. So what we had until very recently is now limited. So what should we do? I agree with this roadmap, but the roadmap in digital language must get the agreement of the region. So what's going on in the region? You go to the Andean group, to the Pacific Alliance, and they ask you, do you have a digital agenda? Do you know what the other integration agreements have? No, I never looked at them because I have my own digital agenda. And this is a geopolitical issue. This shows that we lack legal security in multilateral governments. Multilateralism will be guiding new government distributions and will be focusing on the digital. If we have interdigital agreements like Chile and Singapore, Chile and New Zealand, we talk about the digital agenda. But my concern as a citizen is that agenda, which is good, should be shared throughout the region with one common goal. Or is it that Juan's government is a government I don't like because Pedro was the winner in my country? So we have to be very careful about our positions because we can be held as hostages. 10 million SMEs can become the hostages as they were victims of COVID. So what is inclusion? Inclusion means come, but then we must seek you. So what do you mean by this? Will each country play its own game? Europe has an advantage. Europe is supranational. The disadvantage we have is that we will be supranational. So how could I say it? Who knows when pigs fly? Why? Because the intergovernmental relationship is very strong and the economic asymmetry. Well, I have some experience in negotiating as part of Mercosur, and once a minister told me, do you know that the tail is not moving the dog? And when he told me that, I realized that I was the tail and he was the dog. And I answered, you know what? If the dog is not happy and has no tail, how do we know that he's happy or sad? Well, just to get out of that situation, that is asymmetry. It's easy to criticize. But I'm going back to this same topic, political will. And roadmaps can come up at any point. Roadmaps need to be defined. Then countries have to lead. In the presidential diplomacy, we have to be clear. Countries and leaders in the countries must know that in this world, there is a very huge asymmetry. And the secret to good negotiation is shared dissatisfaction. And not all of you are ready to share due to different historical systems. So what we are doing in Eladi is gradual. We are trying to support SMEs, and the worst comes from the countries, because each country has a different system, but apart from that, there is no political will to decide to go together. But I'm very optimistic, nevertheless. We will keep on working with CAF. CAF will provide us with funding for the digital platform, and we will move forward in that regard. Of course, with today's labor difficulties, people leave the country to do digital work because they get good money, working abroad, working for international organizations, getting some immunity, earning salaries in dollars. And how can I put it? So many benefits that we cannot give them when they work here. But companies today need to think about that. This is a digital issue. And so this is like a therapy for me. But this issue and the instruments pursue one goal, only one goal: social inclusion. Without social inclusion, we will have no trade, no social peace. This all depends on the fact that every single country works together for a new type of revolution. There is a revolution today in this game of power. If I were told that questioning President Trump as a candidate is because President Putin and President Trump got together to do something against Mrs. This all has to do with human rights, and this is very important. And we need to work within the region because our region is not doing well. And it's also true that large blocs do not treat us as a bloc. They get hold of us one at a time. So each country has the whole of America. In ELADI, we are 13 countries. Most of them have free trade areas with Europe and with the United States. And Mercosur is sailing in a suicidal irrelevance, lack of modernity, and not being able to adjust and do what it has to do. So I think that the digital would be a social solution. This is what young people will have in their education. This is what will bring the informality of jobs into formality. But let us not do it one by one. If we talk about Latin America and the region, we'll see what happens in terms of solidarity. Because when we cry, remembering Bolivar, we can be very romantic, but the reality is very negative. I am a historian, if you like, and this is something that comes over and over again. Once a telegram was sent during very difficult times, a telegram was sent to one of Artigas' chiefs, and he was told, "Sell yourself." That was quite a mistake. He said, "Come to us," but he read it wrongly and said he understood it as "take revenge" in Spanish. So he killed everybody around him. So we need to be very careful when we read the messages. The world has so many enemies and rivalries. People want to take revenge. So let us not take revenge. Let us all come together, which is important. We need to work together for social inclusion. So you need the digital to help you ensure that social peace is a reality. if you do not work, if you have no employment, you will not convey social peace to other institutions or to government. So this is our commitment. This is the dream of Aladdin, and we want to do this quickly. I don't know if I'll be able to see that dream come true. Thank you. We thank Mr. Sergio Abreu. OECD also has its agenda. It supports G20. It's in the border of the digital agenda. With that experience, with that know-how, and the availability your center has to help Latin America, Federico Battaglia will talk about this experience. It's a great honor for me to be here with you. I would like to raise 3 points. We are all convinced about what needs to be done. We know that cooperate is necessary, and we are focusing on how to cooperate. And I would like to talk about how much we need to evolve in these cooperation alliances, partnerships, and frameworks, and how to do things differently. But before doing so, let us look at the title of the Declaration of Montevideo, Building Together in the Digital Age. Building together, I would say building together this digital age and in the digital age. These are two different things. If we talk about building together this digital age, we mean how together we define rules, frameworks, objectives, responsibility. But if we say building together in the digital age, it means working together in an era that is influenced or committed to a deep transformation in the digital to produce public goods. So these two things need to be tabled. In the framework of ELAC, we mean how to work together in this digital era to move forward in this digital agenda. The digital agenda has many branches, many different objectives in terms of development and livelihood and so on. This was like a preamble. Now, on how to support partnerships in digital transformation together with ECLAC and CAF, we have produced studies on economic perspectives for Latin America and the Caribbean, and we pointed out the different roads ahead and possibilities for Latin America to really go through a digital transition that is inclusive, solid, positive, so that it can help countries and citizens overcome some traps in terms of productivity, inclusion, institutionality, and environment. This document is very much aligned with what we have been discussing over these 2 days, and that is included in the Declaration of Montevideo. Now, in this document of Latin American economic perspective, we have a specific analysis on the role of international partnerships for cooperation. I'm not going to repeat all we've said because we are all convinced, but there are some points which are important and I need to underline them before talking about the outlook. We have a new model of partnerships. We here have the director from the European Union. His office was called the Directorate for Cooperation. Now it's called for Alliances or Partnerships, and we must point out that difference. We are moving from one system that talked about cooperating, working together, to partnerships, which means defining together where we want to go to. As Secretary Abreu said, where we're heading to together and what we need to go from A to B. This is not just a semantics change. It's a different way of working with new tools, a different way of recognizing different interests or values. Sorry, different values, but a common interest. But it is important to work together and understand each other better. And this is what we've been doing with CAF, European Union, and ECLAC in this development in transition, how to cooperate, work together, and move into partnership, going from working together to defining together what needs to be done in a digital framework, for example. So this means that we have different partners. In these 2 days, we saw it. There are company representatives, regulators, government representatives. So we need all these stakeholders to come and talk around the same table. We need also to measure in a different way, to be successful. Being successful means that our growth will be stronger or different. How are we going to close different gaps? In Latin America, a positive thing is that internet coverage, digital agenda, internet use is very good compared to other parts of the world. I like to underline that the glass is half full. So how do we measure success? We can move from an agenda that is focused on aid or help to an agenda that is based on investment. Investment that requires a framework of public policies so that investments produce positive results. These are quality investments because they will advance inclusion, reduce gaps, and create quality jobs. And these new partnerships go beyond financial cooperation. As we discussed here, we discussed technological cooperation, partnerships that define regulations for the sector, for example. So this requires to move forward in a rather different way. In the last 5 years, we tried to redefine this cooperation and partnership paradigm. And we have a very good foundation. Now we need to build on that foundation. When I read the declaration, I think it's a very good point of departure. The objectives are very clear. The goals are very accurate in terms of figures. And there is a common understanding of moving forward together in the digital era. So I hope also that we will build this digital age together. And in closing, let me say that you can count on us, OECD Development Center. Many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are members. We have partnerships and work together with CAF, ECLAC, European Union, Inter-American Development Bank, Euroclimate, and so we need to sit around a table and have different stakeholders with different points of view and comparative advantages so as to get a clear narrative, a clear agenda that points the way forward. Thank you for this opportunity to be here with you. Well, thank you, Federico. Yesterday, when we held a meeting with countries to start aligning the work plan for 2022-24, Chile explained many things and told us about digital rights promoted by the government of Chile, an opportunity to cooperate in leadership, also anticipating what Santiago will do. So Claudio Araya, Under Secretary for Telecommunications of Chile, you have the floor. Let me thank ECLAC for providing this opportunity and fostering this agenda. Having a digital agenda today speaks of the survival of our nations. We are living in societies without social peace, without equity. Without social peace, we have no economy. So we have been trying to generate digital equity as a necessary element for equity in life. If we look at the goals in this agenda, we have goals. You all have the agenda, right? These goals, take a look at the goals. They refer about the reality of our continent. 5 of them have to do with infrastructure, with digital connectivity, how to make people able to participate through the digital. The other 5 have to do with how states can provide digital services, how can states help people acquire digital skills. So for us, this part does make more sense and is very motivating, because it all boils down to the fact that public management is simply looking for the happiness of people. And the happiness of people is built around different dimensions. One of such dimensions is knowing that tomorrow I will be able to eat. And to talk about the zero digital gap that we are fostering, I will share an experience I had in Tarabacán region in the north of Chile. This is a cliff near the sea in the desert. We have a regulation for digital modernization, and this generated that in order to control the overexploitation of marine resources, when fishermen get to the port, they have to complete a form, and it's a digital form they have to complete. This generated an effect. When the 3G was not working, that was the only connectivity we had at that port, the fishermen got to the port, and the only alternative to complete the form was to go to Iquique, 1 hour away from that port, to complete that form, and then another hour to come back to the port. So that catch, when he arrived, was already 3 hours old. And the impact of that procedure in the life of the fisherman was reducing the cost of fish because it was no longer fresh. That meant those fishermen were not sure they would have food for the families next day. So by digital inclusion, we need to re-articulate the whole system so it involves all of us. If we are 8 people here and we have only 1 lady, that's a problem. When we talk about leadership, people who make decisions, we see a gender imbalance. When we talk about digital connectivity rates, I leave Uruguay outside because Uruguay did the homework correctly. Uruguay is an exception. But if we talk about digital connectivity rates, 2/3 of households in Chile have fiber optics. How about the rural areas? What happens in your respective countries if you look at rural realities compared to urban realities? So our motivation is the following. In order to ensure social peace, we need equity that includes digital equality for all genders, for all ages, for all ethnies, for all geographies. And these are the efforts enshrined in the first 5 goals. If we don't do that, our economies will not be digital economies. For economies to be truly digital, we need to meet the 10 goals. So it will be wonderful to meet in Santiago in future to really tick all our achievements. We still have a long way to go. How do we measure certain qualitative aspects? But at least we have a good foundation to know where we stand, to get a clear picture of where we stand today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al subsecretario.
Thank you very much, Mr. Under Secretary. Thus, we conclude this roundtable, but not the conference. In order to close the conference, I'm going to give the floor to Heather Paupas, the president of this 8th conference, who will give us a final closure of these 3 days of work. Thank you very much. I don't need to go to the podium. I'm in good company here. It's very difficult to close a conference after 3 days of such hard work. And this panel in which many concepts were mentioned, it's worth listening to all of them and even continue commenting on them. So it is difficult to close these 3 days of work. The first thing I would like to do, of course, is to thank the international delegations that have joined this meeting and also thank ECLAC and CAF for the coordination of the conference. Thank those who have traveled many kilometers and also those who live here but represent other countries in the region. By the 19th century, there was a prime minister in the UK, in England, who pointed out something like this. Lord Palmer, exactly. Here, the history professor is giving me some pointers, who said something like the following: countries don't have neither permanent friends or enemies. What they do have is permanent interests. And going back to the reference to football in this World Cup, that doesn't want to leave anyone behind. There are only losers, no winners. It's not a competition. It's a work of collaboration. We have an agenda. We know where we are going. And the only thing we can do is to work for the coming generations. So thank you very much for being here, for having been with us, for participating. And if Natalia from Communications allows me, I would like to close with a short video that we prepared with the communication team of FAGESIC. Government delegations. 50 international institutions and organizations. 86 panelists. People participating in person, 200, sorry. 800 participants online.